builds into the intellectual capital of the planet over the next several hundred years. In other words, great universities will be centered around the thought processes that will arise from this tripartite joining. Now, in addition to that, the Siberian link goes all the way down into China, because this is not Siberia as we understand it now, but Siberia of the future, which will be an amalgam of the Russian and the Chinese as they learn to live together in this new environment there. And then the Canadian experience is not merely the production of crystalline material, but also somehow is welded and melded to the First Nations peoples that live north of where these crystals will be discovered. They're going to be a vital part of this, and we just don't have any further clue as to that. We also see that there's a connection between Cuba and all the way on the other part of the planet, connection between Cuba, Japan, and the Muslim countries of Southeast Asia. And again, this is going to be an intellectual sort of a connection that is not related to the new electrics, but is going to be somehow very key and pertinent to hyperdimensional mechanisms or machinery or whatever we end up dealing with in terms of our future. So in my way of thinking about it here, my little viewpoint is that, I'll probably be buying my flying triangle, my hovering triangle craft that can take me to Mars. I'll probably be buying it from Cuba or Japan as opposed from Siberia, but the engine is probably going to come from Siberia, South Africa, and Canada joined together.
This makes sense. We have here a gyrocopter that was put together in South Africa. It's now delivered here in Germany. No one here knows how to fly the thing, but eventually we'll fly even better things on solar energy, maybe. Anyway, next question, still from Japan, from my friend Ruben, is the following. The Wingmakers literature mentions the discovery of the Grand Portal about the end of the last quarter of this century, which would be 2025, which is astrologically also what we call the beginning of the spring of this century, which is also the moment when Pluto leaves Capricorn and goes into Aquarius. That could make sense. That's sort of an insertion by me. And then the question goes on to say, I know that the linguistics might not be able to show relevant data pointing to this event, the discovery of the Grand Portal. However, do you see any other similar discovery or disclosure? For instance, what about something such as the blank slate technology, BST, or the One Language Intelligent Network, OLIN? Do you know about that? Can you go a little bit into this?
I'm aware of those, but we don't see those as being, how do I want to say it? Their longevity and usefulness doesn't extend as far as 2025. Let me stop and say that when we start getting over 2013, we're dealing almost entirely with our long-term data sets. These data sets are by their very nature a smaller level of granularity than either the immediacy sets, which take us out about 3 or 4 months at the farthest extent, or the shorter term sets, which can take us out to the 8, 9, or 10 months with some decent level of granularity. Once we get into the longer term data, however, there are indeed relative bulges. So we have a bulge of data where we have more granularity that suggests that the discoveries that will occur in 2009, that will be announced in 2009, will have their first little level of maturity in 2013 and begin the construction of or the society will begin to realign itself around the maturation of those thought processes under the form of the new electrics in 2013. This is not to say that life is beautiful from that point on, because it's going to be very harsh and a large degree of struggle and suffering, although successful and satisfying somehow, that will take us from 2013 to approximately 2024. And around 2024 is when we see the maturation of the new electrics into a stable form of organization for humanity that appears to extend 82 years beyond that. Once we get to a certain level of our data within the longer-term data sets, we're no longer talking about years, but it talks about the greater archetype, which is a human generation, which we've put down to be 21 to 25 years. Just taking the 20-year approach to it, we're looking at about the maturation of the process from 2024 being able to extend out some 80 years without a significant alteration.
This makes sense because of Uranus, okay? I can throw that in, particularly as to new electrics. Uranus ruling that an 80-year cycle, 84 years would make absolute sense, by the way.
Okay,
Sorry,
then that's perfect. And we'll also see a peak of this stuff. That is to say, a grand alteration, something that occurs in the early, in 2020 to 2025, itself will mature in 2041 and join with the new electrics, and that further extends another 7 or 10 generations of humanity beyond that. I can't say what those things are because the level of granularity is just very small, and it doesn't give us much more than this vague hint. But the joining, the 2020 to 2025 is the maturation of one part of a cycle that begins and extends for 80 plus years, and it is joined in 2041 by something else that starts in that period of time, and then the combined things in 2041 seem to have a 10 generation or 200-year impact on humans. Make sense?
This makes total sense. I just listened to you very carefully and took this in at a psychic level, kind of like with Nordic presence and stuff. Based on astrology, what you just said, the dating really makes sense because Pluto goes into Aquarius, leaving Capricorn, leaving all this undoing of society behind in 2024, 23, 24, and goes into Aquarius for a long time into 37, 41, I don't know by heart right now, I'm sorry. And then comes an 80-year cycle, 84-year cycle with Uranus, and the 200 to 250-year cycle that you describe is either the full Neptune or the full Pluto cycle. So these beginnings and endings of phases you gave make sense. And in the past, I have seen that your dating matched some sort of astrological viewing of the situation by myself. I'm just throwing this in to say that I understand the dates that you're giving us. Now,
okay, it makes sense. I say it makes sense that way because we have to acknowledge that if my work is accurate, then astrology must work, simply because all of these things in a rational universe, a structured universe, all of the various different pointers that have any understanding of how the universe works must therefore, in spite of the words that they're lost in, express the same idea.
Well, based in mathematics and positions, that makes sense. Now, I'm going to continue with some follow-up questions from friends who are present here, and then another couple or three more from our readers. One question from Johnny was the following, financially, politically seeing. Do you see that the European Union and the euro currency is breaking down? And if so, when? Over?
We see that indeed there are stresses against the actual continuation of the European Union. These stresses will manifest themselves both in the currency and in the social order as we go forward over the next year from November 4th of this year through to November 2nd of 2010. During that period of time, the stresses on the central bank and warfare model will be felt globally. Places like Southeast Asia will have less effect, perhaps more violent and brief, but societies will be more stable. Those that have been attempted to be forced into existence, such as the European Union, will have a longer period of suffering, although perhaps less intense over that entire period. End of statement.
Makes sense. Understood. Second follow-up question coming from Gail, who is here with us concerning the U.S. She is from the U.S. What is, quote, unquote, meant by horrific in the relationship to the collapse of the USA? Is that the military model, or what is that about? End of question.
This has to be looked at, actually, I think, to describe horrific. Let us look at Bosnia, the separation of the Baltic states as the Soviet Union collapsed. While we don't have the balkanization here in a physical form in the U.S., we have that in a metaphorical form in the various subsets of the populace and the various levels of repression. So, for instance, horrific includes the the collapse of the central bank and the warfare model. But as it collapses, those people that are in power will attempt to assert power any means they can to maintain the status quo as long as they can. And this will include in our data sets, the attempt to use force to get everybody to buy back into the common consensus paradigm, even though that paradigm has died, even though the use of that force is doomed and it will never succeed, they will nonetheless attempt to do it. This will also bring forth a counter response from various different groups of the populace, and it may become so bad, and I say may because we have no definitive data. Once we get into the chaos of this next year, it becomes very, very difficult for us to separate out things that are more archetypical. We just see the archetype of chaos without being able to get down too much and describe the chaos much more than larger words. But it may get to the point where various groups in the U.S. attempt to reassert or take revenge, so to speak, on past wrongs. It may also be that there's an engineering method put out to attempt to direct that energy. This is the part that really, I think, is my most frightening vision that we get. It may be that the powers that be decide to sacrifice the Jewish population of the United States in order to keep the United States as a contiguous social whole that they can rule. And they may use the scapegoat approach of saying, oh, no, it's not us, it's not the evil Zionist, it's the generalized Jewish population, and you all guys go out there and slaughter the Jewish population and then feel better about it, and when you're all done, come back under our control. That makes sense?
Well, yeah, okay, let's move on to something more positive. Yes. Okay. Let's go into another question from a friend who is present here. Do you have any data or opinion, ideas, also your own take on the subject of DNA activation during the magnetic changes, and what changes do you see in physical or emotional or in mental state related to this topic, DNA activation? End of question.
We don't, as humans, really understand DNA. It's quite clear that a lot of the speculation about DNA contains some truth. So we know, for instance, that the individual substrands of the DNA actually can emit light between themselves and deal in a level of knowledge transfer through photonic activity. It's also probably true that the vibrational levels of the universe create DNA in vast quantities in order to create complexity, because complexity is part of the nature of the universe. It's further true that the DNA of the human beings contains within it markers as though it had been genetically modified. Now, I happen to know this personally because I used to work for the Department of Fisheries here in Washington State, and for a period of time in the 80s in the Department of Fisheries, we did this work with salmon in an attempt to save the salmon, where they were investigating the salmon DNA. As part of that, in the building that I worked in, where I was doing computer work, directly below me was this thing called the head lab, where they would take the heads from the captured or from the salmon that had come back and extract from those the heads of these fish little tiny bits of DNA and these markers, that little platinum rod markers they had put in to be able to separate farmed salmon from wild salmon. In the process of doing that, they would then do DNA analysis, and once I had them do some DNA from myself, and we did DNA from other individuals just because we were goofing around and it was fun at the time, and you wanted to see what your DNA looked like. Curious, one of the questions I asked the guy was, why does my DNA show all of these individual markers the same way the genetically modified fish DNA and other DNA did? And they had no explanation for that except to allow the thought to come out that indeed our DNA has been genetically